Hello. Welcome everybody who is joining us. We are going to wait a few minutes as folks get connected. So if you don't mind, while we're waiting to get started, if you want to drop into the chat where you're tuning in from, if it's just you and your dog, or if it's you and your 3 kids or your partner, let us know where you're tuning in from, how many of you there are. We'd love to hear where you guys are. And so we'll get started in a minute. Awesome. I see California, DC, Virginia, Portland. Welcome. We're so happy to have you join us. Oh. And for those of you who are just connecting, we're going to get started in a few minutes, but let us know where you're tuning in from and how many there are watching with you. We'd love to find out. Oh, cool. We have some family members. Oh, Ariel, looks like your mom is on. And 2 cats, so that's nice. Family joining. I love to see it. So keep dropping that into the chat and we will get started in just about a minute. Okay. Looks like our numbers have leveled out a bit. So we are going to get started because I know that you don't want to hear from me. You want to hear from Ariel. So I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Sarah Eckert. I am a communication specialist in the Office of Polar Programs at the National Science Foundation. So the National Science Foundation and the Office of Polar Programs oversees the U.S. Antarctic program, which operates our stations in Antarctica. So some quick housekeeping before we get started. We are talking to Ariel in Antarctica. Bandwidth is definitely a concern and an issue. So for that reason, all of our attendees are muted and we don't have video. So that we can make sure we maintain a stable connection with Ariel. Now, I say that knowing that it's possible there might be a moment or two of delay or freezing. We just ask that you be patient. Ariel will reconnect with us and we can continue. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature of our Zoom webinar, and we will have plenty of time for Q&A after Ariel's presentation. Finally, this webinar is being recorded. So following the event, we will be sending an email, likely sometime next week, to everybody who registered, and it will include a link to the recordings, some additional resources for you to learn more about Antarctica and Ariel's work. So quickly before we get started, I wanted to tell you where we are coming to you from. So Ariel is at McMurdo Station, Antarctica. It's the largest of 3 year-round research stations that the U.S. Antarctic program operates. And she has been out in the McMurdo Dry Valleys across the McMurdo Sound, studying really cool microorganisms. The McMurdo Dry Valleys is a really unique part of Antarctica. It's one of the only areas really that's not covered in snow and ice. And I know Ariel is going to get into that more. The McMurdo Dry Valleys is approximately 4,800 square kilometers. So it's a large area that they are studying parts of. So introducing Ariel. Ariel is a fantastic science communicator and researcher. She has been to Antarctica multiple times and has been able to bring back some incredible footage and stories about microscopic life under the ice and in the McMurdo Dry Valleys. And I'm going to let her take it from here so that you can hear all about what she has going on.
Thanks so much. Hey to everyone. I'm just going to be pulling my slides up here and sharing them here and getting on with the presentation momentarily. All right, there. So I'm going to take a moment just to get my gloves back on. I'm here in McMurdo Station, as they said. It is currently -1 degrees Fahrenheit wind chill. So it is a cold day, but this is summer. So for Antarctica, this is as good as it gets sometimes. At least the sun has come out a bit today, so it's a little bit better. And I've put on an extra layer or two, and I've got hand warmers in my mittens. So between all of that, hopefully I'll be able to not freeze out here. Hopefully if there's any freezing, it'll just be the videos occasionally, but we'll get through it. So I always like to start my talks with this image. It's one of my favorite images from one of my favorite spacecrafts, Voyager 1, a spacecraft that's going to the outer reaches of our solar system and beyond. And in that orange band up top, you can see there's like a little bright pixel in it. And that's actually Earth as seen from about 4 billion miles away. So I always like to say that's where you can find me if you need me. But the reason why I love showing this image is because it really shows us how science and space exploration change our perspective of ourselves and our place in the universe. And that's what so much of my work focuses on. I actually come from an art background, so I'm not actually a scientist, but I do a lot of work in science nowadays. But I started out in art school, getting my degree in graphic design, and then serendipitously actually then getting a job at NASA and doing a lot of work with them. And I really love how space exploration and art and science and science fiction can all really change our perspective of our existence here on this planet. And so that's what a lot of my work in Antarctica also focuses on. And Antarctica is, I think, a continent that's often underestimated. For instance, the most basic thing about Antarctica is that it's larger than the US and Mexico combined. And a lot of people don't think of Antarctica that way. They think, oh, it's something that's not even really included on maps. But Antarctica is actually a massive, massive continent. And so even though I've spent a decent amount of time here, I've only seen a small portion of this continent so far because it's just so huge. So the thing about trying to get to Antarctica originally, as someone with a background in art, was I wasn't really sure how I was going to get here because I wanted to contribute to science. I wanted to do more than just go here as a tourist. I wanted to make a contribution that would be meaningful to both science and people around the world. And so I came across the National Science Foundation's Antarctic Artists and Writers program. And it's this amazing program that sends artists and writers to Antarctica to really interpret the land and really make amazing art out of it. But unlike these two artists that you can see in the field here that are just like sitting calmly and drawing and illustrating what they see, I'm not actually really great at drawing. I'm not a great illustrator, but I wanted to do something that would be meaningful for both art and science. And so I started talking with a lot of researchers in Antarctica about what was sort of missing from their science, or what was something that they always wanted but were never able to do themselves. And I learned through talking with a lot of them that a lot of people come to Antarctica as biologists to study the ecosystems and learn about the life here. And you might be thinking, well, what life? Like, there's penguins, so are they all penguin researchers? So there are penguin researchers here, but Antarctica is actually full of life. You just can't see most of it. Most of it's invisible because it's so incredibly tiny. And because so many of the biologists that come down here they do this amazing research telling us what kind of creatures live in the soils and in the ice here, but they very rarely take any photos or videos of them. And so I identified this as a gap and started fashioning myself after being a sort of wildlife filmmaker at the microscopic scale. And realizing that a lot of people actually don't know that there's life in Antarctica. And part of that reason is because they're never able to see it for themselves. And so I had this plan. I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to apply for this grant, and then I'm going to go to Antarctica. In reality, it took me 5 years of applying for this grant in order to actually eventually go to Antarctica. So it was a long journey, but I stuck with it through the ups and downs and made it to Antarctica. And when I got the final yes that I was going, this is how I felt. I was just elated and really excited. But I was also a little nervous because I am someone, since my mom is on this Zoom, she'll know, I do not like being cold. But I knew I really wanted to go to Antarctica because the science here is just so exciting and amazing, and I'll get into a lot of that. And so even though I'm still cold and I still don't like being cold, I love being in Antarctica. And so this was the very first time I was able to see Antarctica out the window. The planes that you take to go to Antarctica are military aircrafts. They have no windows in them. All they have is this very tiny porthole. And so this is me filming out of that tiny porthole on a military aircraft and getting to see Antarctica for the first time with my own eyes, which was just an incredible experience. And so, this session is about Antarctica not being full of only snow and ice, but to touch a bit on the ice part of it, Antarctica is covered 98% in snow and ice. That is really the main part of this continent. And so a lot of my project that I did the first time I came to Antarctica on this artist grant was to look at specifically life underneath all of that ice. And so I went out onto the sea ice where there's this hut on the sea ice. And inside this hut is where divers actually dive below the ice. The ice here is actually 9 feet thick. And so these divers go down and they go underneath the ice, like you can see here. And they dive in like -2 degrees Celsius water because it's salt water. It doesn't freeze at freezing temperature. And I thought, who would want to be diving in Antarctica? That sounds especially cold. But then I was able to actually experience it for myself without becoming a diver. There's a metal tube that they insert into the ice, and you can go down into this tube, and that's me going into the tube. And then when you get to the bottom, you can see this beautiful ceiling of ice, and all those little dots are fish. So all those little dots are like fish under the ice. This is me in this metal tube, pointing out how excited I am about seeing all these creatures. But there's sea spiders and sponges and all these different types of life under the ice. So this is what that tube looks like from the outside. It's a really weird looking thing. And you get to be suspended between the sea ice and the seafloor here in Antarctica. And this is an example of one of the creatures that you can find in this area, an ostracod, also known as a sea shrimp. They're beautiful little creatures with these frilly little feet. They're really just amazing. There's also diatoms, which are microalgae that have glass shells around them, and they come in all different types of geometric patterns and shapes, and they're just gorgeous to look at. So that's another example of things that you find underneath the ice. But I wanted to keep looking at things underneath the ice, so I actually also wanted to look at creatures that live inside of glaciers themselves. And so this is one of the glaciers in the Dry Valleys, and we went hiking up this glacier in order to look for life that lives inside of it. These little holes that you can see on top of the glacier are called cryoconite holes, and they're formed when little pieces of dust or sand actually blow on top of the glacier, and because they're a little bit darker than the glacier themselves, they melt down into like a soupy little hole, and then that hole freezes up on top. So in this video, you saw us drilling an ice core, but at the bottom of that ice core, there's a dirt puck, and in that dirt puck lives all these creatures inside of a glacier, just having the time of their lives because they're able to survive in this extreme environment. So an example of some of the creatures we find in those cryoconite holes are rotifers. My colleague Byron Adams refers to them as sort of Oompa Loompa creatures. They're just really squishy and weird looking things, but these are actually microscopic animals. So they are actually part of the animal kingdom. Other things we find are like ciliates, and you can see them eat things and poop out things. You kind of get to see their whole digestive journey because they're so transparent. And spiral cyanobacteria like this, which looks like party confetti in a petri dish. Just really amazing sort of life forms that exist inside these glaciers. So another example of life in the ice itself is blood falls. For those of you who don't know Blood Falls is one of the most unique places on Earth. It's essentially a subglacial pond that is full of iron, and it spurts out occasionally up to the top of the glacier. And when it does, that iron oxidizes and it becomes iron oxide and creates this amazing red sort of waterfall look. Blood Falls, when it was discovered over 100 years ago, originally they thought it was red algae, but when they soon discovered that it was iron oxide, they then realized that, well, okay, this is a really salty subglacial pond full of iron and no oxygen and in total darkness. There's no way life can survive there. But it was only in the last 10 to 15 years that they were able to determine that life actually does exist inside of Blood Falls. So there's bacteria that live in there in darkness without really any oxygen and in water that's twice as salty as the sea. And I love Blood Falls because to me, it's really a monument, both in nature, it's this beautiful natural phenomenon, but also a monument to science and staying determined to discover life in really weird places. And so much of the work in Antarctica focuses on that. And so here's Blood Falls, a shot from my drone a few weeks ago. And as you can see, it's just this really amazing natural phenomenon of just iron oxide pouring out and staining everything on the outside. And so this kind of gives you a different perspective of that. So the first time I came down here, my project was to develop Life Under the Ice. Life Under the Ice is a website where you can actually go and see all of these creatures that I filmed in Antarctica and go find them, pan around, zoom in and out of them, learn more information about where they were discovered and what they are. It really gives you the feeling of being here in Antarctica and putting a petri dish under a microscope and then being able to move that around and see different creatures. So that website is lifeundertheice.org. It's a really great resource to check out and look around and have fun with. Sometimes it's nice also just to put on some music and just watch some microscopic animals doing their thing for a while. It's kind of, you know, a very calming experience. So that's what I did with my first expedition. But as the title of this whole program says, Antarctica is not all snow and ice. Antarctica is 98% snow and ice, but the largest area of Antarctica that's not fully covered in snow and ice is the McMurdo Dry Valleys. And the McMurdo Dry Valleys is about a 45-minute helicopter ride away from where I am. In fact, you might even hear some helicopters coming in and out while I'm giving this talk, because I'm right next to the helicopter pad here. But the Dry Valleys is a really unique place in Antarctica where we can actually study the continent itself and the soils of that continent. So it's a way of actually being able to understand the Antarctic continent in a place where we can't really get to it very easily in other places. Other places in Antarctica, you're over like a mile high in ice. It's incredibly difficult to drill into. So the McMurdo Dry Valleys provides a really unique opportunity to actually look at the continent without doing a lot of ice drilling. So the team that I'm out here with this season is the McMurdo Dry Valleys Long-Term Ecological Research Group. They are nicknamed the Worm Herders. They are the soils team, but they're nicknamed the Worm Herders because they look at nematodes and other microscopic animals in the dry valleys and are able to report on changes to the climate over several decades and changes to the ecosystems and the animals that live within them. So this is a photo of me and the team in Beacon Valley a few weeks ago. So to give you an idea of how distinct the dry valleys are from the rest of Antarctica, this is footage that I shot from a helicopter going over Beacon Valley, and you can see this valley just has no ice in it. It's bare, you can see the ground, but you'll see as we turn this corner in this helicopter, you'll soon see the edge of the Antarctic ice sheet and where it ends. And so you'll be able to see what a stark contrast the dry valleys are to the rest of Antarctica, and how it's this unique place where a lot of the mountains and the altitude block the ice sheet from entering in this part. So my project this time, being embedded on the soils team, is both to help them with their lab work and their field work, but also to film a docu-series supported by National Geographic about the dry valleys at multiple orders of magnitude. Here's that helicopter I talked about. They're just taking off. You might be able to see. But I'll just shout over the helicopter. So yeah, I'm filming this docu-series of the dry valleys, looking at it from multiple orders of magnitude, because you really need multiple lenses in order to see these creatures. A lot of them, nearly all of them, are microscopic. And it's inspired by this film that came out several decades ago called called The Powers of 10 by Charles and Ray Eames. And it was this sort of groundbreaking movie that looked at life from the atomic level out to the galactic level and all the levels in between. I'm not going to be looking at the atomic level or the galactic level, but I am filming creatures at the microscopic level. I've got my drone to get some aerial shots. I've got macro lens. And I'm also going to be looking at things from satellite view and orbit. So to tell really this story about the dry valleys and the life that lives in it, you really need to see those amazing helicopter shots and aerial shots of it, but then to be able to drill down and see the microscopic life that lives there. And so this is a macro shot example. And so this is a macro of the soils in the dry valleys. And you might be thinking, okay, you did a macro shot of some dirt, what's the big deal? But it's interesting to think about how these creatures live, because all these little grains of sand here, you can see it's a little bit wet, and it's in those really thin films of water around these grains of sand and dirt that actually that's where these microscopic creatures live. It's in these really thin pieces of water all over the dry valleys. Another place that we can find them sometimes are microbial mats like this one. They're super slimy. I like to think of them as slimy layer cakes. This is a layer cake of different microorganisms that self-assemble into a microbial mat. And the top of the microbial mat might be more photosynthetic organisms, and different layers end up feeding off of each other. So it's kind of like a miniature food chain in action, so to speak. I like to think of microbial mats sort of as coral reefs. They're kind of this protective housing that allows a lot of microorganisms to survive and not be exposed to the really harsh conditions outside of them. So the creatures that live inside of these microbial mats and in the soils are things like tardigrades, which are also known as water bears. They have 8 legs, they have claws on their legs. You can see 2 eye spots. So they don't have fully functioning eyes, but they have the ability to sense light and dark. They're super, super cute. This one especially, I think it looks, kind of gummy bear-like, very squishy and cute and adorable. And it's just amazing to be able to see them. And tardigrades, of course, are famous for being able to survive in extremes. But one of the things that I really love also about tardigrades is that you can find them everywhere on Earth. So you don't have to go to Antarctica to find tardigrades. Wherever there is moss in your backyard or in a sidewalk crack, you're most likely walking by an entire zoo of tardigrades every day without knowing it. And I just think that's really fun. This is another example of a tardigrade that we found out here. This is a predator species of tardigrade. So this tardigrade, instead of eating moss and cyanobacteria, or at least in addition to it, it'll also eat nematodes and other creatures. So this is kind of like the big lion out here in the dry valleys in Antarctica. And you can see it sort of like hunting around and sniffing out, trying to find its next meal. And this tardigrade is probably like 3/4 of a millimeter in size. It's pretty large for a tardigrade. The other one I was showing was probably more like 1/4 of a millimeter in size. They can get as large as a full millimeter. I've never seen one that large, but they can. In that case, maybe if you looked really closely, you would be able to see one with your naked eye, but for the most part, they're microscopic. Other creatures, so I mentioned our team is nicknamed the worm herders, and that's because they really focus on studying the worms down here, also known as nematodes. This is a species of nematode under the genus Plectus. And this one is actually really fascinating because this type of nematode doesn't reproduce sexually. You can see in the middle of its body, it has a bunch of eggs inside of it. And those eggs are actually clones of itself. So this nematode doesn't mate with anyone. It just creates clones of itself. And it's able to do that when it finds a more stable environment. And it can get by with just having clones of itself, and it doesn't need very much genetic variation. Other nematodes like this one, this is the Scottnema nematode, and this is the only type of nematode here in Antarctica that's endemic. So this nematode you can only find in Antarctica. And I was mentioning other types of nematodes need to reproduce sexually. This is one of them. And it does that to get more genetic variation and to be able to survive extremes. And in fact, we see this nematode in more extreme environments than the previous nematode. So this one typically is in salter, drier environments than the last one. You can see in parts of this video also it sort of gulping down a bunch of water, which is just really amazing to watch and see it feeding. Finally, also there are rotifers, which I mentioned earlier were sort of like the Oompa Loompas. They can open up their crowns and actually sweep in little debris into their mouth. So in this case, you can see it's kind of like a Roomba, and it's sweeping in all of this food into its mouth. That feeding thing in the middle of it is not its heart. That's actually its kind of esophagus or jaw. So that's it just sort of swallowing as it's sweeping stuff in. And also, again, this is a microscopic animal along with the nematodes and tardigrades. There's also amazing life that survives by burying itself pretty much underneath rocks. Rocks that are really lightly colored like this one, if you turn it over, which you'll see in a moment, you'll find life living underneath it. So here is a hypolith, and so you can actually see green on the underside of this rock, and it lives there because if it lives on the underside of the rock and the rock is lightly colored, you can still see or it can still get light from the sun. So it's able to find lightly colored rocks and be able to get light from the sun because the rock is translucent enough. And by being on the underside of the rock, it means it's protected from the wind and the cold. It's a little bit warmer. It's maybe a little bit wetter, and it's where life can survive. So another place that we can find life in the dry valleys in rocks is actually inside the rocks themselves, not even on the underside of them, but inside them. I'm going to keep shouting over the helicopter because it might be a little while, but so please excuse me. But you can find life inside of rocks in the dry valleys. So the lighter colored rocks here are actually sandstone from a beach that existed during the Jurassic era. And this beach got condensed over time, but this sandstone is actually really great for life to live inside of because it's porous. And so life can live inside of the rocks and actually still get enough sunlight. And again, a little bit more humid, a little less dry, a little less windy, and it's just enough for life to cling on. So these rocks are actually full of microorganisms living inside of them. I think we have 2 helicopters coming in, so that's why it's extra loud. But so the reason why I was saying like all of this work and why I love it is because I think just like space exploration, it changes our perspective of our place in the universe. And I think through changing our perspective of our place here on Earth by looking at all the extremes that life can exist in, I think it can really make a difference in how we view ourselves, how we view our Earth, and how we view a lot of the science that's done here. You're getting the authentic Antarctic experience with all the helicopters coming and going. So here's an example of my macro lens that I use to film some of these videos while here. And again, there's life all over Antarctica. You just really need the right lens and the right perspective in order to view it. And so I'll close with 2 or 3 things to maybe bookmark. One of the organizations I volunteer with that definitely provides a different perspective on Antarctica and a lot of the research here is the Polar Impact Network. They're an inclusive network of racial and ethnic minorities and allies in the polar research community. And their mission is to support, connect, and highlight the stories of Black, Asian, Indigenous, people of color, and minority ethnic professionals in polar research. And really everyone who works in the polar community of any occupation. You can probably see this helicopter going by right behind me. It's kind of cool to see. The next resource is I have a book coming out later this year that you can pre-order and check out. It's called Out There, The Science Behind Sci-Fi, Film, and TV. Astronaut Mae Jemison wrote the foreword to it. It's beautifully illustrated. And you might be wondering, well, what does this have to do with Antarctica? So there's a number of places in this book where I talk about the experiences I've had and other people have had in Antarctica and how that can be informative to science fiction and science and sort of the intersection of the two. So definitely check that out if you get a chance. And then finally, I've been here for 2 months in Antarctica so far. I've been writing a newsletter from Antarctica about my time here. If you scan this QR code, you can subscribe to the newsletter, but also definitely check out the archives because you'll see a lot of photos of behind the scenes from my time here and stories I've written about what it's like to be here in Antarctica. So definitely check that out. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ariel. We are so blown away by everything that you have seen. I know I am. I see we have some of your colleagues walking by. I will say someone did ask if Byron was going to make an appearance. So I know he's probably keeping warm inside, but you can wave him over. So before we dive into the questions, and we have so many amazing questions, I just want to tell everybody now, we can't get to them all. We're going to try. I'm sorry, but please, thank you for asking, I should say. Tell us what we're looking at. I see some flags. I see a big mountain. I know you said you're by a helicopter pad. And actually, we didn't really hear the noise from the helicopter. So you were good there.
Oh, then you must have just heard me like shouting for no reason.
No, you're good.
Yeah, so behind me is Ob Hill. So that's one of the more notable hills here in McMurdo Station. A lot of people hike up it. In fact, there's been a challenge this season about if you hike up and down Ob Hill 37 times, then you will have hiked the same altitude as Mount Everest or something. You know, people invent fun things here. There's also a building behind me that's kind of like a welcoming center. It has a lot of flags of different countries here. Those are the flags of countries that are signatories to the Antarctic Treaty. And then I'm going to rotate around a little bit if I can. So behind me, you'll be able to see the helicopter pad and some various cargo. And then if I rotate out here, you can sort of see a building that's the Science Support Center. So there's actually like a lot of infrastructure here in McMurdo. And if you're just dodging between the buildings and everything, you don't need to dress as warmly as I am now. But to stay out here for a long time, you definitely need to dress warm. So yeah, it can be comfortable here if you're not doing much work outside, but otherwise, yeah, gear up.
So someone did actually ask, when it comes to your equipment, do you have equipment with extra large buttons so it's easier to press when you are wearing gloves and all of these layers?
I would love that. That would make my life a lot easier. Unfortunately, I can't get custom gear. So, you know, I don't have any like 3D printed like modules to make my equipment any easier. Maybe I'll do that eventually, but Yeah, so I've just got a series of systems. Unfortunately, there's a lot of my equipment that I have to use my bare hands in order to operate. And so I have mittens and hand warmers. And so I'll often like use my bare hands to do something and then immediately throw them in mittens with hand warmers. And it does actually get kind of tough sometimes. So I always have like multiple options, gloves, hand warmers, mittens, warm pockets, things of that nature. Actually, I should show you what Byron gave me here. He calls these gauntlets. These are the hugest mittens I've seen in my life. This is the size of my mitten. This is the size of this gauntlet. So I haven't used these before, but this might become part of my equipment next time.
Yeah, we want to keep you warm because it is chilly in the height of summer. And as you were starting, there were some folks who are experiencing some very cold winters here in the US. But seeing as it's the height of summer for you, definitely stay warm. We got a lot of questions about your equipment. I'm going to come back to that. So instead, I'm going to just start with a really fascinating question about how you think the changing climate, we hear a lot about it impacting penguins or polar bears or other macro, like charismatic megafauna. What do you think changing environments will do on the microorganisms that you are seeing and the microscopic environments of Antarctica?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, because that drives a lot of the research that my team here does and that a lot of researchers here do, because the way Antarctica responds to climate change is not necessarily how the Arctic responds to climate change. And the things and the implications that happen here can be different in its own nuanced way. So in the dry valleys, we've been looking at the data of the climate over the past few decades, and only in the past few years has it really been trending towards seeing a definitive tick towards a warmer, wetter, and windier environment in the dry valleys. And that has implications for the life there, not because necessarily they'll die if it gets a little bit warmer. They're fairly hardy creatures, but what could actually happen is if Antarctica becomes more habitable, so it becomes a little less harsh, microorganisms regularly blow around in the wind. And so microorganisms from elsewhere in the world come to Antarctica just through the winds, through the feathers of birds, and different ways. But they all die here when they arrive. So Antarctica is really its own barrier. And if Antarctica becomes more habitable, other organisms might be able to take a foothold here. And that means these organisms that I showed you, which are only like a handful or so of them, they've only been used to having a really small list of neighbors for a very, very long time. If they get new neighbors, those new neighbors might outcompete them. They might be predators that eat them. They might struggle in that way. So the way climate change affects the dry valleys is something where there's still a lot to figure out, but there's definitely concern about what happens when it becomes more habitable, they have more neighbors, and maybe some of these organisms that are really hardy for being in extreme weather might not be so hardy if a higher organism comes along and eats them all up. So that's one of the things that we look into.
That's fascinating. And one of the things you just mentioned relates to another question, which is about how life even came to the McMurdo Dry Valleys. And perhaps before answering that, how were the dry valleys formed? Why is it that they are dry or they are not covered in ice? How much can you share with us about their creation?
Yeah, so I'm not a geologist, so I can't go into specific details, but the dry valleys in part are dry because of the transantarctic mountains. So if you recall, I showed a map earlier, or kind of like a photo map pointing out where the dry valleys were, and there was this huge mountain ridge separating the continent. That's the transantarctic mountains. And so in part, they block some of the ice sheet from entering the dry valleys and create sort of a difference in weather, and so that sort of affects how the dry valleys are what they are. Some of the dry valleys have been carved out over time through glaciers. So one of the main glaciers in the dry valleys is Taylor Glacier, a very, very long time ago. It used to extend much farther than it did. And as it's retreated slowly, very slowly over time, because the glaciers in the dry valleys are pretty stagnant, it carved out these valleys. And so a lot of the valleys in the dry valleys were originally carved out by glaciers. I think the other question was asking about, what was it, microorganisms and, oh yeah, how they've gotten there in the first place. So a lot of people are still investigating those answers to a lot of the organisms. One, as I said, the Scottnema nematode is actually endemic to Antarctica. Some of these creatures have been separated off from their other similar creatures of similar species by many thousands of years, sometimes even pushing towards millions of years. And that's what's really fascinating in a way, because, you know, a long time ago, very long time ago, Antarctica was a rainforest when it was in a different part of the world. It's long, long, long since it was ever a rainforest, obviously. But there's interesting questions to ask about how life survived as Antarctica became the Antarctica that we know it to be, and what creatures were able to hang on, and which ones got blown here and just really were able to survive. But the thing that's interesting is a lot of the creatures that we do look at, we're increasingly figuring out how long it's been since they separated from sort of the mainland, the rest of the world. And some of them separated quite a long time ago. And in a way, I sort of think of it as kind of like Madagascar separating from Africa, and you've got lemurs and all these amazing creatures that are really specific to Madagascar. And here in the dry valleys, you also have specific species that are really unique for the dry valleys themselves.
They're just super small.
Yeah, they're just very small, tiny, tiny lemur.
So on that, someone wants to know if you've made any unique discoveries of any animals living in Antarctica that maybe had not been found before. And maybe you can't tell us, maybe it's top secret, but.
Yeah, I mean, you know, things that we've discovered this season that are not, you know, they're not the first discovery, they're not the first time anyone has seen them, but they're very rare. So I showed you earlier a Plectus nematode that had the eggs, and I said, oh, this is, you know, it makes clones of itself, it doesn't reproduce, so it's all female nematodes. Like, I think it's something like on the order of like one in every 10,000 of them, there will be a male Plectus. And we did discover this season a male Plectus, and since it's like on the order of like one in 10,000, we were pretty excited about it, and it's an area that definitely should be studied more. So that was kind of exciting, like when you get to see rare things out here that maybe other people have seen, but again, very few photos or videos of these things. So that's what I'm here to try and help with, is to make sure that we get really good documentation of both the really common creatures and also the ones that are more rare.
Wow, that's so cool. Life with all women, I'm sure people are wondering what that might be like with all females. So
Byron always jokes like, you know, doesn't that sound great?
Yeah, it sounds like it would be a really unique community for sure. So yeah, with all of these microorganisms living in the soils, someone wants to know, do you have to be careful about where you walk when you're working in the dry valleys, or what you touch, or your equipment getting into these regions that don't have a lot of human interactions, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a really important topic. So the first week that we come into Antarctica, we spend the whole week in training. And part of that training is how to be a responsible person interacting in the dry valleys, because it does have so few humans. So when I go out to the dry valleys, I'm out there with my team. Usually a lot of times it might be just me and my team. So it might be me and 5 or 6 other people, and that's it for a very far ways away. And so we get training on how to walk and where to walk in the dry valleys. And it's really important both for the nature itself not to be disturbed, but there's also a lot of really sensitive ecosystem monitoring instruments out there that also, like, if you step in the wrong place, you can disturb someone's entire science experiment that they've spent years on. So you don't want to do that. So we get special training on how to do that, and we try to minimize our footprint as much as possible. So in the Dry Valleys, we camp in individual tents, and there's no plumbing, so we use outhouses. We get water from some of the ice outside and melt it down and use that very minimally to clean dishes and things like that, but we don't do laundry or anything of that nature out there. So a lot of everything from the way we walk around the Dry Valleys to the way we live there is all about minimizing our footprint as much as possible.
Awesome, that's great to hear. So before I transition to some questions about your gear, and maybe we'll do some rapid fire questions, I love this one that just came in, and I think it's a great way to wrap it up. You talk about how Antarctica is thought of as being this really kind of dead continent. And the question is, how does the biodiversity of Antarctica compare to the other parts of the world that we think of as more fertile or as more biodiverse?
Yeah, so it's definitely all relative. So in terms of nematodes, since I touched on that a few times, studying nematodes here is much easier than studying nematodes really anywhere else in the world. There's only so many species here. There's only so many species that can survive here. And that presents a unique opportunity for researchers to be able to understand nematodes in a way that they can't elsewhere because there's more limited sort of factors here to consider. So in that way, if you scoop up a bunch of soil here in Antarctica versus a bunch of soil in your backyard, definitely you might scoop up like 40 different species of nematodes or something in your backyard. Out here, maybe 3 if you're lucky, and you really have to search a wider area for them. So in that way, Antarctica isn't fertile the way that you might think of in a lot of places in the US. But the thing that blows my mind is, even though it was my original project to come here and show how Antarctica is actually full of life, just being here even this time, my mind just keeps getting blown at how much life there is here. It really is. You go out to the Dry Valleys and you find life in dry soils and wet soils, around frozen lakes and glaciers, inside of rocks. I mean, life is everywhere. So it's not as abundant as it would be elsewhere in the world, but it's still everywhere. And it really, I don't know, it's kind of mind-blowing just to think about all the little nooks and crannies that life is able to survive in Antarctica, and really that it isn't dead. It is more limited than the rest of the world, but it's far from dead.
Oh, I love that. That's such a great message. All right, so we're going to switch to maybe some rapid fire questions here. You show your macro lens. What magnification do you get?
So I think that macro lens promotes itself as just being a 2 times macro lens. So that's the Venus Laowa probe lens. But why it's so great for what I'm doing is it's a really great macro lens for video work. So most macro lenses, you move them at all, the depth of field is so minimal, it'll be really shaky cam. But this specific macro lens was built for video. And so I can move it on a rail, and that's how I've been making some of those pans, is on a motorized rail with that. And I'm able to get really smooth shots with a much larger depth of field. And so that has really mattered a lot while I've been here. It's been a great tool.
Awesome. And you showed some drone footage. So someone wants to know what drone you use.
Yeah. No, I love geeking out about the equipment. DJI Mavic 3. It's got a 4K camera on it. For those that some of you might know, some of you might not. DJI acquired Hasselblad, which is a classic camera company. It's a camera that astronauts took to the moon with them. And so they acquired that camera company to make a really nice 4K camera. So the DJI Mavic 3 has been great. I've had no difficulty with it here. If it's a super windy day, I won't fly it, but the wind's been good enough that I've been able to get a lot of shots.
How is your equipment affected by the cold?
Yeah, so I keep batteries packed in on my inside pockets because yeah, batteries can definitely get a little wonky out here. Thankfully with the drone, the motors spin enough so that I'm able, so that they're able to keep warm. So the drone batteries have actually performed really well. That's been awesome. But my camera batteries and everything, they get cold, they start getting a little wonky. So I keep them warm inside pockets in my parka. And so then they're ready to go. And I just have a lot of batteries on me.
That's awesome. You're just carrying all the batteries. Now
Yeah,
you showed,
I'm pumped up.
I love it. So you showed some great footage of these tardigrades and nematodes. Are you filming those in a microscope, start over, with a microscope back in a lab, or are you doing that on site? How are you getting that footage?
Yeah, so on my first expedition, I took a microscope out to the field, and so I was filming a lot of those creatures on site. And yeah, with this season, I'm using a Canon R5C camera attached to a Nikon E200 microscope. So before, yeah, I would go out to the field and I'd film them out there. This season, because my team typically goes out to the field for like a few days at a time, and then we come back to McMurdo to process a lot of the lab samples, it was much easier just to bag up soil samples, quickly shuttle them over to McMurdo Station, and then I immediately put them under my microscope. But as said, like the helicopter time between the Dry Valleys and McMurdo Station is about 45 minutes. So I am filming them as close to in situ as I can get.
Fantastic. All right, I'm gonna just end, and I know there are other questions we didn't get a chance to answer, but Ariel is very active on all sorts of platforms, and I will make sure you all get her account so you can see all the amazing things that she's doing and share her knowledge. But do you have any last words of wisdom that you want to impart on the group? Anything that we didn't get to touch on that you think super important, or you just wanted to know?
Yeah, I think, since there were a lot of questions about the equipment and everything, whether or not you're using fancy camera equipment or you are sketching nature or documenting it, I think, any way in which you want to document or curate the world around you is always just so welcome by so many people. There's so many awesome things here on Earth and even beyond in space to document. And I think, whether you're into creating websites or videos, photos or drawings, or even just writing about, life here on Earth, if you have any temptation at all, I definitely recommend doing it, because even though, Earth is something that we've all grown up on and that we're all pretty used to, I think people are continuously amazed at just how weird and wonderful our home planet is. And the more any of us can contribute to that, I think is a positive thing.
Awesome. I love that. It's a great note to end it on. And so I'm just going to have my colleague Hannah share her slide, our last slide, for everybody. I know we got a lot of questions about links and where to find out more. So there we go. So here you can use a QR code. You can write this down. We're going to keep this up for a minute or two. Thank you so much again for joining us. If you want to learn more about Ariel, there's her website and also her newsletter. Also, the McMurdo Dry Valleys LTER project that Ariel is working with. You can find out more about her work, and then also all sorts of other projects going on in the Dry Valleys. And then more about the U.S. Antarctic program, science going on, and educational resources we have for folks. And as always, follow NSF on social media. We like to share all these amazing photos and videos that we get from Ariel. And as I said at the beginning, next week we'll be sending out an email. It will include all of these links and all of these resources, as well as more. We'll also ask you to fill out a short survey if you're willing to. Let us know what you thought and what we can do next. So with that, I know, Ariel, it is cold where you are. So we're going to say goodbye to you. We'll leave the slide up for another few minutes. Thank you all for joining us.
So great talking with you all.
All right, go get warm.
I will. All right.